Hey, greetings all.
Greetings to you, Bill.
Make sure we have the tape recorder going here. We do. Good. All right. Well, let me ask the Lord to watch over our time together today. Father, we thank you again that we can join together and fellowship by way of computer, and just pray that you would watch over our technology and let everything work well. Just pray your blessing and your health, your provision, your direction for each of us, Lord, as we continue to try to do the work that you've given each of us to do in the parts of the world where you've planted us. Just continue to give wisdom to each one, Lord, as they are working on their projects and trying to make a difference in a particular situation where you've planted them. We thank you, Father, and we just ask you for your direction and your wisdom. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Amen, Lord. All right. Well, we're going to work on some of the other final areas of the chapter 1 that we've not talked about yet. You've been working on the problem statement. You've been working on the purpose statement, which also includes kind of an introductory paragraph on the intent, and then also the research questions. There's just a little section in there just to talk about the transformational strategy. Like I've said, you really aren't going to have, hopefully you won't have a solid idea yet of what that transformational strategy is going to be, but you might have some ideas, and you could just mention them there at this point. We're going to work on assumptions and definitions and the what's called the limitations and the delimitations of the project. And Dr. Henry has some PowerPoint slides that we'll look at here in just a few minutes. Let me just ask if there's any general questions or comments you might have at this point before we get into some of the other content for today.
Bill, I'm sorry if I missed this at some point. Are we required to do any book reviews for this course?
No, not anything other than what you'll be doing in your literature review chapter. Yeah, since for this course you do a whole literature review chapter, we've taken that other reading requirement out, so you can spend as much time as possible on resources that are related to your particular topic.
Okay, and that applies to the weekly journals as well?
Correct. Yeah, you're not really doing a weekly journal in this course.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll just make a couple of general comments before we get into the other content. As you know, in this course, you are preparing a proposal, a 3-chapter proposal. Once you finish that proposal at the end of the course, you'll need to work with a supervisor to finalize that proposal, which will then get submitted to the academic cabinet. You do need to be thinking about a supervisor, someone possibly, if there's a faculty member at VGU, that's one possibility. Someone who possibly you had classes with and you really enjoyed working with, that would be one possibility. If there's someone else that you know, say in your area, in your context, or that you just happen to know who has an earned doctorate, that could also be another possibility for a supervisor. If there's a supervisor from outside of BGU, then we do need to see their curriculum vitae, etc., just so we can have that on file in your student records. But anyway, that's what you'll be working on, say in this course, and then having a supervisor. So I would recommend that you do look at the faculty list on the website and just see if there's people there that possibly you'd like to work with. And then what you do, you would send them an email and just see if they would be willing to work with you in a supervisory capacity. A second person that would be working with you is we've called them a second reader. We're trying to start to use the terminology an associate supervisor. And so that will be another person who will be on your dissertation committee, if you will. Both of those people will work with you throughout the process, mainly your supervisor, but the second reader kind of gets involved toward the end and kind of gives a second set of eyes to look at your dissertation when it's in its completed draft form. And then those two people, along with myself or someone else as a BGU representative, will be involved in your oral review at the end of your dissertation process. And so that's kind of where you're going with this process. Any general questions on the whole dissertation process that I can answer? I have uploaded the new final project handbook that we've just finally gotten that completed, so it is in the course. I would recommend that you at least scan that. There's a lot of specific information there on the dissertation process. We are now required by our accrediting agency to include a lot of general information in any publication, whether it's a student catalog, a student handbook, some kind of a handbook like we have for dissertation. So in that new edition of the final project handbook, you're going to find a lot of information that is just generic to the school. And that's fine. We are trying to meet those accrediting standards. But basically, we need you to look at the specific sections that deal with the dissertation process, and you'll find those listed there in that handbook to give you kind of an overview of the whole process. Okay, any other thoughts or questions on that issue? Any of those issues before we move on?
The second reader is
Yes.
another teacher that we should ask, or who is this
Right.
person? We didn't get.
Second reader, it could be a faculty member or someone else, okay? They, in the past, we've not actually paid second readers. Beginning July 1, which, you'll be graduating next year, so you'll be in that graduating time. That second reader gets a very small stipend. But yeah, you do need to find someone, a supervisor, okay, who's going to be the one who mainly works with you. A supervisor will look at each one of your chapters as you write it and then give you feedback. The supervisor also will need to approve the proposal that you are, once you've gone through this course and received my input and Dr. Henry's input on your proposal, we'll issue a grade for the course. But then you'll use that proposal to talk with your supervisor, who will then look at that and give give his or her feedback. And then once that proposal is in an acceptable form to you and your supervisor, then you'll submit it to the academic cabinet. A second reader will then be involved, not quite as, like I say, not as strongly as the supervisor, but what we've been doing, a second reader, once you get a fairly complete dissertation draft, a second reader will look at that and give additional feedback along with your supervisor, so that you'll have, like I say, at least two people that are looking at that dissertation document to give you any other recommendations before you submit a final document. So yeah, two people. Each of those people do need to have earned doctorates, and they will work with you through the process. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have kind of unrelated question about the literature, the reading material.
Mm-hmm.
So the Creswell's book that is online, I don't know if other people have the same issue, but when I like to use hard copy, so I printed it out. The paging is totally off, and there are lots of grammar or spelling mistakes. I don't know if that was because of my downloading process or that is the reality of the book. And then sensing, it looks like there's only one chapter up to page 21 online. I couldn't find the whole book, so I don't know if you can help me out of that.
Okay, so you've got the whole Creswell book. What was the one that you only found one chapter?
Sensing.
Sensing?
Yes.
I think that's true. I'm not sure you'll be able to find the whole Sensing book. Sensing is on Kindle, I think you have to purchase that on Kindle as a, if you want an online version, you'd have to purchase a Kindle version, or you'd have to order a hard copy through one of the online, or a local bookstore online. But yeah, we're not able, because of copyright issues and issues, it's not always possible to get a free copy of all the books. But we try to get, our librarian Jennifer tries to find as many possibilities as possible to help students out, so it's not quite as expensive.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move ahead so we can get through the content for today. If you have other questions along the way, you can bring those up. We're going to talk about, you could probably start finding those PowerPoints, Dr. Henry. We're going to talk about assumptions and definitions and scope. Assumptions, and Dr. Henry will talk about that more. Assumptions is kind of a vague word at times, as she will mention. Some dissertations, I've looked at some schools, and they'll have, in the introduction chapter, they'll have the research hypotheses. They'll have a whole section on that, and that's usually for a quantitative study. But I think she will explain that a little more. We use the term just assumption and worldview, just the idea that we are trying to have you help the reader understand who you are, where you're coming from, and some of your basic assumptions. And I think, as Dr. Henry will mention, sometimes, assumptions will become hypotheses that you are going to try to work within your project, or they may not be. Just the fact that I say I'm a Christian, that's an assumption. That's a worldview that I come at a project with. That's an assumption. I assume that there is a God. I assume that there is the Son of God named Jesus Christ. Those are some of my basic theological assumptions that a reader may need to know. Okay, just so that I'm being upfront to say who I am. But other kinds of assumptions become even more specific, and Dr. Henry will talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk about definitions, and then just kind of what we call limitations and delimitations. So go ahead, Dr. Henry. I'll give you the microphone.
Okay, hello to everyone again. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I have two pieces. Definitions and limitations.
Okay, don't worry.
Okay, I have two presentations that I'm going to share with you, both of which I will put in the course. This first one, I have basically reviewed the literature from the readings to help us to understand the focus of assumptions, definitions, delimitations, and limitations. Dr. Payne just explained that from a BTU perspective, we're asking you to present assumptions alongside your worldview. That is one way to look at assumptions. However, in research, the assumptions become important because it's not so much, though assumptions do reflect your underlying worldview. But it's not so much a definition of your personal assumptions with regards to issues of faith, but your assumptions are directly related to the study that you're going to conduct. So Merriam and Tisdale states that the researcher needs to make explicit, and that's the important thing, explicit, the assumptions with which they come to the study. One of the things you do in research, I always say to students, is that in research, you need to be totally transparent. So you need to say what you have done and why you have done it. Total transparency, everything. Why did you choose to do this study? What did you come to the study with in terms of your own bias, your own interests? So Merriam and Tisdale talks to us about being able to identify what are the biases that we bring to the study, what we should know about you, the researcher, that will help us to understand how you are approaching the study, and their faith comes into play in terms of your Christian faith and commitment, how you might be interpreting the data, what you're going to be sensitive to, and so forth. What is your relationship to the topic on the investigation? Now, in terms of interpretation of data, assumptions, personal assumptions are important. But in terms of objective research, and that's why we have to put our assumptions out there are guidelines for how you interpret data. And in research, the big word is objectivity. Yes, there is always going to be a subjective component that you come to the research process with. But objectivity demands that you be able to stand outside of the study and interpret it in a way that other people would understand and agree with you. So I just want to make that comment in terms of interpreting the data. Interpretation has to move beyond personal commitment, understanding, etc. Sensing adds that the basic assumptions of the study should be stated concisely and listed in a meaningful order. He encourages researchers to make tacit assumptions explicit, and that's the point. Sometimes we are not even aware of the biases that we bring to a study until others around us start to ask us questions. And I think in our discussions, I saw that happening as we ask each other's questions about the why of the research and the what of the research. But again, the point is to be, as a researcher, you're required to be transparent. And so you have to be able to make explicit those hidden assumptions, hidden beliefs, hidden biases that you bring to the study. And then he quotes Kleineman, who says, examine your emotional reactions to the setting, the study, and the participants. If you do not, your feelings will still the research process, and you will not know it. So we are acknowledging that when we come to research, we bring our whole selves. We bring our beliefs, our emotions, our commitment, our worldview. We bring everything to the research process. And whether or not you're aware of it, your internal feelings about the issue will come out. So the better thing to do is to state it up front. The next issue is the definition of terms. Generally, this is in chapter 1, and it is important to identify and define the key variables of the study. I think I've mentioned to you before, as we've looked at qualitative and quantitative studies, that in the qualitative studies, we do not necessarily have to define the variables at the beginning, but we encourage you to do so, because the thing about the qualitative study is that the findings of the study are going to influence what variables come to the surface and how they are defined. So, but you start off with a definition, and at the end of the study, as a result of the findings, you may say that you need to restate the definition, or you may say that the findings are in keeping with the definitions with which you start the study. However, in quantitative studies, definitions become very important, because quantitative studies measure the variables, and whatever variables impact your study, you have to define all of those variables, or key terms, as we may call them. Criswell and Criswell advise that students define terms that individuals outside the field of study may not understand and that go beyond common language. Now, in the case of definition of terms, the emphasis is on the academy, the academic. There are terms that we use loosely in common language that everybody think they understand or people agree with. However, because research is about measuring and assessing and evaluating, we don't take for granted that we all mean the same thing, so that your variables / key terms must be defined. And in the discussion I've had with you online, there's some of you that I mentioned to you, I identify a phrase or a term that you've used, and I've said, you will need to define that term, because that's important. Criswell and Criswell writes that in qualitative studies, because of the inductive evolving design, inquirers may define few terms at the beginning, though they may advance tentative definitions. Instead, themes may emerge through the data analysis. In the procedure section, that is in chapter 3, the authors define these terms, you define them in chapter 1, and then in chapter 3, you should restate those terms that you define as they surface during the process of research. This approach is to delay the definition of terms until they appear in the study, and it makes such definitions difficult to specify in advance in research proposals. That's for qualitative studies. But we are guiding you in such a way that we're helping you. Many of you, and I think most of you, seem to be moving towards doing qualitative studies. We still invite you and encourage you to define the terms. That's important. Because when you define the terms, it will help you in terms of your own research process. And also, the term defined becomes a foundation for the development of the interview questions or the focus group questions or the questionnaire that you're going to use to gather your data. On the other hand, in quantitative studies, which are operating more within the deductive models, it is important that you define terms early in the research proposal. And for the quantitative studies, there's always, and in our own study too, we have a separate subsection that says definition of terms. It's part of the table of content. It's there in the chapter. And when we're reading research, like I said to you earlier on, you don't usually read research like you read other literature. You read it in sections. So you look at a study that you may think you're interested in, and one of the first things you do is you read the abstract. And after you've read the abstract and you've become aware of the key variables or terms in the study, you are likely to go to that section of the study and see how did they define it, because you want to see if their definition is congruent to your own understanding of the term or the variable that is being studied. In mixed method studies, the approach to definitions might include a separate section, and that's what we're doing. If it begins with qualitative data collection, then the terms may emerge during the research, and they are defined in the findings or results section of the final report. And I mentioned that earlier. Let me stop here for any questions or comments before I move on to delimitations or scope of the study.
One thing I might mention too, and we tried to caution students on that, is that when you're defining terms, we really would like you to use documented definitions as much as possible. Sometimes
Yes.
people just tend to, put out their own definitions, but we really would like you to have looked at the literature and define your terms based on what you've discovered there within the literature.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Payne, for bringing that up. That's important. Research focuses on that which is objective. And so there's a sense in which it limits our creativity if you look at it from the point of view of you writing a novel, etc. But because research is grounded in what other people have done, it's important that when you identify your variables, when you define them, you don't create your own definition. You use definitions from within the research literature. And that is important both for the qualitative and the quantitative study. And especially so for the quantitative study, because when you go to measure the variable in the quantitative study, you are measuring the variable as it has been defined. And so usually what you do for the quantitative study is you need to be able to find out who are the key writers, who are the key researchers in your area of study. And then you use their definition because you are measuring what has already been measured to see if your study comes up with the same responses, etc. You are building on what other people have done, so you don't create your own definition of terms. Okay, thank you, Dr. Payne. Delimitation, scope of the study. The delimitation of the study is the focus and scope of the study as in any research. One can only focus on selected aspects, certain areas of interest, or a restricted range of subjects and level of sophistication. You will recall that I've been saying over and over in our discussion that sometimes I've commented on the breadth of the subject that you seem to want to study. And I've said to you, you need to focus, because the reality is you're not going to be able to study all of what you propose to do at once, given our limited time. It doesn't mean that you can't study, prepare a study that uses multiple variables. It just means that you have to be aware of what it means when you have a study with multiple variables, because then you have to define and measure and study each of them and how they are related. The section entitled Method of the Study, and this is in your chapter 3, will describe the scope of the study. Hence, in this section, the writer will describe the subjects of the study, the variables of the studies, test instruments and procedures, special equipment, type of training, time and duration of the study, and analytical procedures. So delimitation is comprehensive, and it is at the core of the study. It describes that. Now, in terms of type of training, I'm working with a student who said to me that he is going to use a research assistant because he is going to be interviewing, which is interviews a one-on-one exercise, multiple people. And he is not able to do that, well, not that he's not able to, but given our time limits, it is advisable that he uses someone else. But if you're going to do an interview and you're going to have a research assistant, you will have to train that person to make sure that that person follows the procedure as you have defined it in your report, your research report. So in your chapter 3, if you're going to use a research assistant, then you have to state that, and then you have to state what would be the responsibility of the research assistant. For example, in doing the focus group is really a group interview. But in focus group work, it is always recommended that you have an assistant, and that person has certain responsibilities in terms of observation and listening as you have the dialogue within the focus group. So that's important. Just mentioning that as we go along. Limitations of the study. Here we are presenting what are the weaknesses of the study. And basically what we're doing in the limitations section is we're anticipating weaknesses and addressing them before somebody questions us about the obvious, and many times the weakness of the study may not be obvious to you, the reader, or the person who's doing the research, but for those of us observing, it's usually very clear. So the best thing you can do for yourself is to be aware of what are the weaknesses, what are the limitations of your study. And our weaknesses cover several areas. For example, your methodology. You shouldn't be there. And one of the responsibilities we have as supervisors is to make sure that you have a good research design. But that is one major weakness of studies that are put aside or criticized as useless. If the design is poor, then your results are going to reflect that the design is poor. That is why chapter 3 is so important, that you have clarity on the method, the design of the study that you're going to do. Sampling problems. How do you select people to participate in the study? Do you go and stand by the street corner and ring a bell? And those who stop you interview, no, you don't. You know, I'm being ridiculous. But the worst thing you could do is have what we call a convenient sample. Now, it is possible to do research using convenient sample, but you have to be aware that's a very weak study. The idea is that your sample must be representative of the population or of a subsection of the population that would be of interest to your study. So your sampling technique must be clear. You must be upfront about how you selected the participants for your study. Uncontrolled variables, errors in test administration. These two are applicable especially to quantitative studies. In a quantitative study, for example, if you're doing an experiment, how do you administer the experiment? Having chosen your sample, did you do a pretest? In a classic experiment, you have to do a pretest. It would be useless to have an experiment without a pretest, because you do the pretest and you do the post-test. You administer the treatment, and at the end of the exercise, you want to compare the pretest with the post-test, to see if what you may have administered made a difference in the results. So it's important that your test administration follows basic pattern. Generalizability of the data, that tongue twister. Now that is a challenge with qualitative studies. In quantitative studies, you have to be able to have done such a good job that your findings can be generalized to the population. So once again, the person who's working with you in terms of helping you in your design, your supervisor, has to work with you in that area. Representativeness of the subjects, we've talked about sampling there, and reliability and validity of the research instruments. And this is applicable to quantitative studies. And one of the ways in which we deal with the challenge of reliability and validity of research instruments when we're doing a quantitative study is that we use instruments that have been used by others. Because usually, if the instrument has been used by others, it has been tested for reliability and validity. But if you design your own instrument and we have not taught you that skill, so we're not even going to ask you or suggest that you do that. That is, instrument development is a skill for which you are not prepared. So you definitely, and even if you are prepared with that skill, the recommendation is that you use an instrument that is already out there, that has been tested for reliability and validity. And that is pertinent to a quantitative study. Let me stop here to give you a chance to make comments or ask questions with respect to your own studies.
I have a quick question actually two.
Okay.
Some of this I feel like, I mean, as we're going through it, these delimitations and limitations and the kind of nailing down the details of the study, I'm getting confused on what would go in chapter 1 and what would go in chapter 3.
Okay.
The research methodology. That said, I also feel like as you're explaining these things that until me anyway, actually do the study, I won't know this. This is what the study will tell me.
Yes. Research is about doing. And it's one thing to have the lecture, but it's another thing for you to apply it to your specific research. So you're right. To make that comment. In terms of what goes in chapter 1 and what goes in chapter 3, in our requirement, you have to put in these things that we've discussed in your chapter 1. You have this section on definition of terms, delimitations, etc. It is chapter 1. And then in chapter 3, you're going to restate it. Okay.
Dr. Henry, I want to ask about the previous section on key words and terms, definition of keywords and key terms.
Yes.
And you said the definitions have to come from literature review.
Yes.
And because the literature review comes with chapter 2, so which literature review are you referring to that we would use to
now in chapter 1, you are reading literature to help you to hone in to the focus of your study. So you are reading literature. Chapter 2 is a comprehensive report of the literature, but the foundation of chapter 1 is in the research literature. And you definitely will have to use the research literature to define the variables, key terms of your study.
Okay, so I'm using the literature that I've reviewed under chapter 1. Now, how many? When you talk about keywords, key terms, is there any guidance in terms of how many, or I identify the key terms for my my
No, no, there is not. There, we cannot tell you how many key terms you should have. The key terms are related to the statement of the problem that you are going to address, right? The only thing I've been saying to you, I've been warning you about, is that the more variables you have, the more work you have to do. Not saying that you can't do the work, but the research is about the relationship between the variables. So the more and of course also the more variables that you study together, the more powerful is your research. There's that too. So I want you to be aware of that.
Okay.
Any other question? Good questions or comment?
Let me make a few comments here because I'm kind of listening here. I think one issue you mentioned, Melissa, is like when you're in the proposal phase, there's a lot of issues you're not really going to know, right, until you've done some more reading and research. For example, I was just looking at the template. For example, under delimitations and limitations, it says limitations may be difficult to foresee at the proposal stage, but try to anticipate issues beforehand as much as possible. Again, that's just one statement.
Mm-hmm.
At the proposal stage, you are seeking to anticipate issues. We realize at that stage, you are at just the very beginning stage of looking into this topic and the issues. And so we understand that as you're putting together a proposal, you're not going to have all the details. When Dr. Henry mentioned, say, for a quantitative study, you would possibly, we recommend that you use an already developed tool to, say, test a particular issue. You know, people have used, like, I just did an oral review who somebody had used the DISC test, which is a leadership assessment tool to help leaders understand, are they a D, an I, an S, or a C, which each of those, abbreviations stand for a particular style of leadership. Okay, that would be an example of a tested tool. You may, in your research, you may run across identification of some of those kinds of already published tools, assessment tests, okay? In your proposal, you may say, I've looked at these such and such assessments tests, and I'm thinking about using this one or that one. Okay, at the proposal stage, you may not know for sure until you've done more research on thinking, what kind of a tool do I need? At a qualitative stage, you may or may not use an already developed test. You probably wouldn't to start with, because qualitative research means I'm moving into an area of study that I'm not actually going in with any particular hypotheses to test, but I want to just learn more about a particular topic. And so we ask you, for example, in the proposal, to give a few sample questions that you might use in, say, a qualitative interview to get at some kinds of information that you would like to discover related to your topic. So there again, I guess I just want to emphasize the fact that at the proposal stage, we're not expecting you to have all the answers and everything worked out. But we would like you to be doing some thinking, some brainstorming, we use that term, on the kind of issues that you're going to need to address as you get into the fuller study, the dissertation. And I think also, as I was thinking of your question, Arissa, in terms of, the definition section, there's really no determination of numbers of terms, but as you think about, your study, what are some of the big terms? You're working with SCAs, the credit associations, and you're looking for sustainable approaches to development, for example. Okay, you try to think about what terms, what are important terms there? Okay, sustainable sustainable development. Okay, Dr. Henry often will use the terms, variables, because she's done a lot in the work of quantitative study. But, if you talk about sustainable development, okay, sustainable development in that case is I guess we'd call that a dependent variable. It's dependent on what? What is it that you're wanting to do that will possibly increase the sustainable development of any particular project, people, family, whatever you're talking about. So sustainable development might mean a particular set of characteristics for you in your study. That would be something you would want to define in your development. What do you mean by sustainable development? What do various authors mean when they use that term, sustainable development? Could be a very vague term. That could mean, different things to different people, but you would say define that term within the context of your study and authors that you're looking at. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Paula.
Well, when I started, I thought about searching the South Brazil, the slum that I'm involved with. As I was reading the literature, I realized that even in Africa, we suffer the same problems in trying to do an income generation. So I started reading, and as much as I read, I can see many coincidences and many places, especially in undeveloped countries, that face the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking not to narrow that much, and for example, think of slums in Brazil, and I was thinking slums in Latin America. But I don't have time to to go to all those places. So I know I can do the qualitative analysis and research in my place, and at least maybe 1 or 2 places in Brazil that I have a research assistant that could go. But this means I cannot mention, or I can do the research here and mention other literature in other places.
Oh,
or
yes.
I can use the example in my place, or you know what I mean? Can I say Brazil, but if I'm staying just here searching this place, I cannot mention the other places if I don't go? And how can I work with that?
No, actually, you have to mention that the issue of sustainable development, helping people in the slums is a global issue. But your study is being done in the context of Brazil. And what you have identified is doable. You can go ahead with that. What's going to happen in your chapter 3, in your review of literature, you're going to report on what researchers have found about what's needed to be done to help people who live in the slums improve their economic state. And the literature is vast on that because it is a global issue, it is a global problem, and you report that in the literature. Yes, so you can use it, and you don't have to go outside of the area that you've identified already. That's fine. You just work within that subsection. Does that help you? I hope it puts your anxiety to rest.
Yes.
We're not sending you around the world looking at. Okay, good. Okay.
Yes, because I was thinking to talk about the Latin America countries, and I was like, how can I research them? Because many countries with lots of slums don't have literature. Some have, but many don't.
That's true. That's true.
Let me ask you, Paula, I'm just kind of looking at one of the discussion areas here. You're looking at the relationship between, say, self-esteem, family background, and income results. Okay, if that's kind of you're going to work, and then how to develop income generation programs in vulnerable environments, such as a slum. So there again, in terms, if we use the terms variables, okay, you're looking at a relationship between how does a person's family, a person's self-esteem, their background, how does that to relate to their ability to generate income? Would that be a fair statement in terms of, one of the relationships that you're looking at?
Yes, actually, I changed after the first one. I changed to the key elements to develop a successful income generation project.
Okay. So you're going to look at key elements that have been included, say, in successful income generating programs. So you may look at some other, in your literature search, as you enter a term such as income generation programs, criteria of integration, income generation programs, you may run across studies, programs that have been implemented in other countries and other places that you'll be able to glean some ideas from, right? That you could then apply to your particular context. But so, in your literature, that's as Dr. Henry said, you're not just confined to your own area. You're taking ideas. That's what a research does. Research takes ideas that have been useful in other places and then adapting them to a particular context where you're doing. So that would be very appropriate within the literature as you're looking at other examples of successful income generating programs that have been used in other places that you could then find some ideas that would be helpful for your context.
Okay, any other question? I do have a PowerPoint presentation too. I don't know if we have time to complete it, but I'll put it into the course. Let me close off this one and at least pull that up. Okay. An assumption is a realistic expectation of something that we believe to be true. However, we do not have adequate evidence to support this belief. In other words, an assumption is an act of faith which does not have empirical evidence to support it. The assumption provides a basis to develop theories and research instruments and therefore influence the development and implementation of the research process. Assumptions are statements that are taken for granted or are considered true, even though they have not been scientifically tested. They are principles that are accepted as being true based on logic or reasons, but without proof or verification. And here we see the relationship between assumptions and hypothesis. One of the things we usually say is that the hypothesis is an assumption that you will test. So the assumptions are basically beliefs and ideas that we hold to be true. The hypothesis is a prediction. The assumption, there's often little or no evidence, whereas with a hypothesis, you can statistically test and see if you would accept or reject the hypothesis. For example, going to Paula's study. If we were going to do Paula's study as a quantitative study, we may want to propose that there is a negative relationship between slum dwelling and economic sufficiency. I'm just pulling that out. So you're saying that, in other words, what you're saying is that if somebody is living in the slum, that person is not likely to be economically sufficient. So then what you do is you design a study to test that. No, that is now your hypothesis. You have two variables there, and you design a study to test to see if this is true. Now, there's a sense in which we could say, well, you shouldn't even have to test that because that's kind of common sense and obvious, right? But sometimes that which is common sense and obvious, when we test it, we may be surprised at the results. But I'm just giving that as an example of how you take an assumption and you make it a hypothesis and you propose to test it. Okay, the rest of it you will see in the system I'm going to move through to highlight the important pieces. Our research is built upon assumptions. Since a foundation is needed to move forward, you have to assume something in order to discover something. Assumptions listed in research papers may be good sources for research topics. The assumption provides a basis for the conduct of the research. Tested assumptions through research studies expands the professional bodies of knowledge. So we see the importance of being clear to yourself and to the reader in terms of the assumptions that you come to the study with. And here he has identified the different kinds of assumptions and how they're related. You have universal assumptions, the assumptions that are based on theories, the assumptions that we need to conduct research, warranted assumptions, and unwarranted assumption. A universal assumption is that there is a being out there who is greater than us as human beings. The term we use theologically and in the Christian faith, God is there. Belief in God, an example of a universal assumption. Universal assumptions are beliefs that are assumed to be true by a large part of society, but testing such assumptions is not always possible. For example, there's a supernatural power which governs this universe. Then you have the assumptions that are based on theories. If a research study is based on a theory, the assumption of the particular theory may become an assumption of that research project. And he just gives an example from his study, his area. A study on Roy's adaptation model will use assumptions of this particular theoretical model. Some of the common sense assumptions may be developed to conduct a particular study. For example, the prevalence, and this is from the medical field, of coronary artery disease is more common among urban people as compared to rural people. So you do a study to test to see if this assumption holds true. Then the warranted assumptions, these are tested along with evidence to support. For example, regular prayers bring success because they boost morale. Unwarranted assumptions, these are stated without any supportive evidence. For example, Almighty God exists everywhere in this universe. Now, from a Christian perspective, we may debate that. and from a faith perspective, people may debate that, but it is what is described from a scientific position and unwarranted assumption. Then he gives us here other examples of assumptions. And here, reflecting Paula's study, people in underserved areas feel underserved. People want to assume control of their own health problems. Stress should be avoided. Health is the priority of most people. These are some examples of assumptions. I want to move on to the section where he talks about limitations. Limitations are restrictions of the study due to theoretical or methodological reasons, which may increase the credibility and generalizability of the research findings. Usually there are two types of limitations in research studies, which may reduce the credibility and generalizability of the research findings. These are what we call theoretical limitations and methodological limitations, and I mentioned that in the earlier presentation. Theoretical limitations, they restrict the ability of research findings to be generalized due to the use of specific theoretical concepts in the study, or limiting the study of variables through operational definitions. In research, operational means measurable. So a good definition in a research study is a definition that can be measured. Methodological limitations usually result from some of the method factors, such as an unrepresentative sample, a weak design, a single setting, limited control over extraneous variables, poor data collection procedure, ineffective use of statistical analysis, etc. Therefore, researchers usually mention the limitations of their study so that the reader can get the idea about the credibility and the generalizability, of their study. How did I get out there? Good. Okay. Effectiveness of planned teaching, he gives an example. Effectiveness of planned teaching on the knowledge of staff nurses working in the psychiatric unit regarding physical restraints for psychiatric patients in selected hospital of Vidarbha region. The study is limited only to nurses working in that specific unit. The study is limited to the population that speaks English. The study is limited to registered and licensed nurses. It is limited to nurses who work with GNM and they have a BSc in nursing education. This study will be limited. I need to move this up. No, I go back there, I'm sorry. In trying to move this. The study will be limited to the experience level of the researcher. So this is just giving you an example of how you are very specific in stating the limitations of your study. As we've said, with a qualitative study, you may not be as clear as you would be in the quantitative study. Nevertheless, it is important that you recognize the limitations of your study. Questions, comments, these will be placed in the course outline.
So, Dr. Henry, if you can, and I know you said this already, but like summarize the difference between delimitation and limitation. What would be the key differences? The
delimitation says, it says to you, for example, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to study X amount of people within this specific geographic area or cultural area. So that's your delimitation. You're identifying the subjects of the study. The delimitation, another term we use for that is scope of the study. So you're just stating what are the parameters of your study. For example, Paula mentions that her study is going to be done among slum dwellers of a specific geographical location in Brazil. That's one way to identify the scope of your study. That's not the only measure, but that's one way to describe your scope. I hope that helps you, Arissa.
Let me mention one other thing to that issue, Arissa. The way I understand it is that the term limitation are issues that you may not have control of. Okay, you are in a situation and you only are able to interview a certain number of people, or you're restricted from interviewing certain people in a particular corporation because of management restrictions. Okay, that would be something that maybe you couldn't control. That's the limitation. A delimitation is something you choose to do. Like you have limited your study to a particular location, to a particular age group, whatever it might be.
Would another way of saying it be limitations about method and theory, something, and delimitation is more about the physical geography?
Not necessarily. Like I say, the limitations are limitations, restrictions, or whatever you want to use, that are inherent in what you're trying to do because of just the nature of the situation. A delimitation is a limitation you choose to put on your study. You narrow your focus to a particular set of people, to a particular age group, or whatever it happens to be. But a delimitation is something that you have chosen to apply to your particular study. Where a limitation are just some of the external issues that you may not have control of. That's why I understand those two terms.
Any other question, observation? Okay, I'll just stop share and go over to Dr. Payne to complete this session.
Okay, yeah, a lot to take in. Do your best to kind of work on these three sections, the assumption section, the definition section, the limitation/delimitation section. And then I'll see, Dr. Henry can be giving you input in the discussion area. I'll give you input on the written assignments. And hopefully, some of these concepts become more clear as you're actually trying to write them out. That's the best way I find, is that you work at it, you get feedback, you make revisions. And I think Dr. Henry made a good point, I think, at the beginning of this course, is that in this kind of a course in the proposal writing, you're doing a lot of revising and revising and revising. Sometimes that can be very difficult. That can be very hard on our self-esteem, right? Because we feel like we're doing it all wrong. It's not the way to think about it. But the way to think about it, you put down something on paper, somebody else looks at it, like a professor, gives you feedback, and then you keep revising and you keep working. I mean, that's the process of research. That's the process of writing. It's kind of a trial and error kind of a process until we begin to produce a product that is going to accomplish what we want it to accomplish within the kind of research context that you're working in. Okay. Well, I've got almost 15 minutes after the hour, so I think we will try to close our session unless there's any final questions that anyone would like to ask. Okay. Well,
were there any comments on the transformational strategy section?
I don't think we said too much on that. I think, let me just look one section here. Yeah, in the research chapter, under the purpose statement, you've got the intent, research question, and the transformational strategy. I'm saying that the transformational strategy at the proposal stage, you may not have a clear idea of what the practical transformations would be. However, this strategy will be developed out of the research that you do. You may indicate some ideas you have here. So that's kind of what the transformational strategy is all about. There's another section called the transformational significance of the project. Provide a brief description of what you consider will be the transformational significance of the project. In traditional dissertations, when you look at a chapter, there will sometimes be a chapter just called the significance of the project or the study. And we just added the word transformational significance since that's, a key word. And so as you look at your project, try to think about what is the potential that this project has for bringing some type of transformation within a context. So again, we're not looking for anything definitive or anything detailed. At this point, you're just trying to do some thinking about how your project may have transformational significance. You wouldn't be trying to do a project unless it had some kind of transformational significance in your mind. We'd just like you to, put down a few of those thoughts in a paragraph or two under that section called transformational significance of the problem. That's a section right before researcher assumptions and worldview as I'm looking at the proposal template here. Since it's come up a few times as I'm looking at papers, not everyone is using the proposal template, and I really encourage you to use that template and do your writing there. Get used to using that template. If you're not accustomed to using a template, this will be good practice. And like I've told some of you just by comments, if you use the template to write, it automatically puts the right format on the headings. It formats the paragraphs by, indenting the first line of the paragraph. It does all that for you. If you aren't writing in the template, then you have to do all that on your own, okay? But I really would like you to become accustomed to using the template. Someone said they only found a PDF version of the template, and I'm not sure what that was. There is a Microsoft Word version of the template. It's called Dissertation Proposal Template. It's on the info page under the files area. And the idea is, say if you're going to write something on the researcher assumptions, you would just highlight, let me just share my screen 1 second and then we will get out of here. Let's see. Are you seeing that template right now as a part of your screen? Somebody shake their head. Yes, you are seeing the template on the screen. Okay, just want to make sure.
Yes.
If I was going to start doing writing, say under the research assumptions and rear view, if I just say highlight this paragraph, and then if I just start typing the something, you can now put in your verbiage. But what has happened, this has automatically indented this first line by 0.5 inches, and this heading already has the right heading style in Word. It's a heading 2, okay? All that happens automatically because we at BGU put together this template with the kinds of formatting that we wanted to happen within a proposal. And we've got the same kind of a template put together for when you actually do the dissertation report. So again, I'd really encourage you to use these. Okay, I can hit the back arrow and that would just put that back so I don't overwrite my stuff. But that's the way you'd use a template. Just highlight the paragraph and then start typing your new content, and it'll overwrite what you see in the template. It'll overwrite it with your content. And then as you keep doing that process, you will have a proposal that has been formatted correctly by the template with your content. Anyway, give that a try and see how that works for you.
Yeah. Hello, is this template Turabian or APA?
This particular one we're looking at is APA. Like if you look at the thing, it says dissertation proposal template APA. And we're really asking, if you're in the DTL program, you really are supposed to be using the APA format. So in terms of the formatting, they're going to be very similar, Turabian and APA. Where you get down to the differences is when you get into the say the reference list. If I'm going to the end of the template, this is an APA template, so all my references are formatted in APA style. You give the author or the institution, the year, the name of an article. If this is Turabian, this reference would be entered in a very different way, okay? But since this particular template is APA, we've formatted it in APA style, and I say that specifically shows up, say, in the reference list. Or APA, everything is double spaced. In Turabian, this would be single spaced with a space between the two entries. So, there's some of those minute differences between Turabian and APA. But again, I really would like you to use the APA template, if at all possible. Okay, enough said. Let's go ahead and go to our business, and I'll start giving you, you'll keep getting feedback in the discussion room from Dr. Henry. And the discussion room is a place where we really want you to interact with each other too. There's a lot of wisdom and you can gain just from each other as you are helping each other work through some of these issues. And Dr. Henry will interject comments as she sees fit. Okay, and then as you return in your writing, I'll be looking at that and I'll seek to give you feedback. I'm working on your research questions and purpose right now, so I should get that back to you within the next day or two, so you'll have that to look at with my feedback. All right, with that, we're going to end the session, and pray God just gives you direction and wisdom for whatever you're seeking Him for. And again, thanks for joining us. We'll meet again next Wednesday, same time, same place. All right. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good week.
Have a
Thanks,
good
bye.
week.
Thanks. Everybody have a good week. Thank you.